Okay, welcome everybody. This is the last meeting of this year and also the last meeting in the official RL debate series. We're very excited to have Tom who's going to present his I think it's very exciting work. It's a lot of math, but as far as I understand, it's just trying to have this like entirely new take on RL and behavior. So maybe without further ado, take it away, Tom.
Sure, yeah, I'll just share my screen. Let's see.
Yeah,
Um,
if you share it's gonna give me like a
Sharing is not turned on.
yeah, I can just allow. So before going into the actual presentation, do you mind telling us a little bit about your background and your trajectory, where you're right now, and your research interests and so on?
Sure, yeah, my name is Tom Ringstrom. I got my PhD in computer science. Is it a little echoey, by the way? I just want to make sure that it's
It's not
not too.
echoey here, but I don't know.
Okay. It's echoey in my room, but if it's fine for you, then it's fine for me.
Yeah,
Um, so yeah, my name is Tom. I got my PhD in computer science from the University of Minnesota. And at the beginning of my PhD, I was very interested in what are sort of principles of flexible animal intelligence. And I sort of noticed very early on, with the help of my advisor, that like a lot of the sort of standard RL theory doesn't get us closer to understanding, I think, like low sample complexity or like sort of flexible animal intelligence. So I did my PhD to try to figure out sort of new optimization principles for thinking about planning in really high dimensions of state variables, but also intrinsic motivation, like where do your goals come from? How could agents decide, you know, um, what is good in a really high dimensional world? And so since then, I've been basically wrapping up the most complete version of my PhD thesis. And right now, I'm in a program called Machine Learning Alignment and Theory Scholars, which is basically a kind of grant organization that pairs you up with various researchers in industry. And so I'm developing my theory further with some guy at DeepMind.
thanks, Tom. Yeah, I guess so. When we met back this in this summer when you were in Berkeley, I took me a while to really understand that I think you're actually quite taking quite a different approach to whatever modeling, planning, and behavior than RL. So I guess it might be helpful for you maybe to clarify in what ways you diverge and in what ways you don't diverge from like the standard baggage that we're coming to this meeting with some standard knowledge of RL, and it would be
Yeah,
helpful to clarify where things diverge significantly and where they don't. So that's basically just a comment I had.
sure. Yeah, sounds good.
All right,
All right. Yeah, I'll just start the presentation then. Um,
let's go.
okay, so yeah, this presentation is called A New Markov Decision Process for Compositional Planning and Intrinsic Motivation Without Rewards. And so the main uh, idea behind this presentation is that I'm going to make the argument that the the sort of standard foundations of reinforcement learning um, don't really promote the right kinds of principles that you would expect flexible agents to have. So you want agents to reuse structure across many tasks, or you want to be able to agents to achieve some kind of compositional generalization where they can use primitives and build up complex structures for complex tasks. Um, so part of what I'm going to argue in this presentation is that small changes to the sort of underlying Markov decision process and Bellman equations underpinning RL can lead to pretty significant changes in how we understand things like generalization or intrinsic motivation. So I'll basically be explaining this work, but also contrasting it with this sort of standard theory. So what's the argument? The world is very dynamic. There are lots of different systems in the world. It's reconfigurable. Different systems can interact with each other outside of your control. And so therefore it's very high dimensional, right? There's a big combinatorial space of possibilities. And so you can have internal states like the state of hunger or the state of hydration, like homeostatic states. You could have world states. You could have states that represent whether you possess an item. All of these different types of states make the world very high dimensional. And so the question then becomes, well, how do you plan in very high dimensional worlds with many variables? And I'm going to make the argument that we really need to promote the sort of principles of compositionality, modularity, and interpretability to get factorized predictive models of what your policies do in order to deal with this dimensionality. Okay, so that would help you plan in high dimensions. But another question is, how did an agent know what a good goal state is in high dimensions? Usually in reinforcement learning, you have reward functions, but it's not really clear. There's this perennial discussion about where do rewards come from? Well, that question gets really hard in high dimensions. You have to be able to answer, why does some complex state vector have any given reward value? So I'm going to argue that there is an intrinsic motivation function called empowerment, which is really a measure of controllability and observability, that really handles this question in high dimensions in a way that I think the sort of standard reinforcement learning theory doesn't. And so to achieve both of these, like high dimensional planning and high dimensional intrinsic motivation, I'm going to argue that we need to compute different types of representations that people you don't usually think about in reinforcement learning. And these are called state-time option kernels. So I'll say more about what this is, but they're basically going to result in factorized predictive models of what your policies do. And that's going to, these representations, these state-time option kernels, are going to be compositional. So it's going to allow us to chain together skills, and it's also going to allow us to justify complex goals. And so, we're going to achieve this by modifying the sort of Markov decision processes and Bellman equations that we normally use in RLM. So here's just a sort of example of what animals in the real world are capable of. I hope the sound comes through, but let me know if it doesn't.
Can't hear that. Sorry.
Can you hear it?
Oh, we can't.
Oh, you can't. Okay. Let's see. Let's see here. Zoom. Do you know how to change the audio settings?
Share audio Zoom.
Share drop down.
Okay, so Michael apparently has a solution here.
I think if you click, I think there's a drop down next to share. I think there's an option to click share audio as well.
Let's see, share. Share. Oh, share sound. I see. Okay. There we go. Oops. Let's see. All right, let's continue to share. Video that this honey badger has the capacity to, do this sort of long horizon planning. It goes and grabs items. It, packs mud balls against the wall, and that sort of changes the structure of the environment. And, just to escape its pen. So there's a lot of, sort of sequential goals or sequential tasks that appear to be, driving the animal's behavior. But then there's the question of like, well, why does Stoffel want to get out of the enclosure? What's the reward for doing such a thing? So I actually had a chance to go see Stoffel earlier this year, and he's like 26 now, so he doesn't really escape. He just like lies in his pen. Um, but if we take Stoffel as a sort of example, we can think of Stoffel as having internal state spaces like hunger or thirst, each with their own dynamics. So Py here is just the dynamics of the hunger space, or Pz here is the state dynamics of the hydration space. And maybe Stoffel has a sort of model of how the world is structured, so represent by this transition function. And maybe there's a symbolic state space for like picking up items or getting things like this. Taken together, a lot of these state variables create a very high dimensional space. So you get this problem of how do you plan, right? Just for this simple example, right? The object that tells you how all of the states or the state vectors transform under actions is very large, right? So you can't represent this object, in a NumPy array or in your brain, just because you can't enumerate all of the vectors. You'll run out of memory or space. So you have to use some kind of factorization of how all of these systems influence each other. So I'll say more about this soon, but we have to you have some kind of way of representing all of these in a factorization. And then there's the question of what's the goal, right? In reinforcement learning, you're usually maximizing reward of some kind, but this leads to the question: well, how do you know what is rewarding in this high dimensional space, right? You could have some kind of linearly decomposable reward function, but this is context free. This is really bad. So you either have to explain where context sensitive value comes from. You actually have to explain where value itself comes from, right? In an open-ended world as well. So I'm going to start by talking about how we can tackle some of these questions with a new form of Bellman equation called option kernel Bellman equations. And this is going to directly optimize predictive representations. So if you're unfamiliar with Bellman equations, RL is usually underpinned by some kind of reward maximization Bellman equation. So this is the sort of form of a standard Bellman equation for an infinite horizon discounted problem. So V here is the value function, which is the expected reward that you will accumulate if you act from the state that you're currently at, X, and if you act optimally under the future. So for a grid world here, you might have a reward at a tree, and therefore your value function, when plotted as a surface, will look something like this. And what you'll do is you'll optimize this value function, and your policy, which maps states to actions, is just going to choose actions which move you up the surface, up this value surface. So the goal, right, is to compute an optimal policy, or at least a good policy. But there's a few problems conceptually. You can't really spend accumulated reward. Reward isn't really like a state. It's not like a fungible currency of any kind. Eli mentioned this in his presentation as well, right? It's not like you're storing some kind of substance or anything like that. Another problem with this setup is that important spatiotemporal information is lost. So what do I mean by that? The when you're optimizing this value function does not tell you when or where things happen under your policy, because value functions really are taking expectations over many reward events and collapsing them down into a single number. So, the probability that you will uh, have a rewarding event and where that rewarding event happens, all of that information is just sort of lost in this expectation. Thirdly, value functions, are a kind of scorecard, right? If you're not saving this information about when and where things happen, value functions don't play a sort of functional role. They basically are just a kind of scorecard that tells you how good your policy is. And the most important problem is that there there is no known decomposition of value functions over high dimensional transition kernels. So this is a low dimensional state space, X. But if we had bold S, where S is a vector of states for all of this stuff, there's no sort of theorem that tells you, well, you can have value functions defined on this space and value functions defined on the Boolean cube, et cetera. And here's how you should mix them to get a new value function for a new problem. There's no principled way of doing that. And so that's important, because since the world is always changing in how different systems interact, and your value function is really a function of the structure of the world, then changes to the structure of the world are going to induce a new value function. So if you're going to say something meaningful about generalization, you have to say something meaningful about how agents should reuse their the representations that they have. So the
Can I ask
problem
a
is,
question?
yeah, of course.
Just a clarification question about, could you spend a few words maybe on what you mean by spend accumulated reward, and also that value functions do not play a functional role?
Yeah. So reward isn't, it's not like a currency. It doesn't help you plan. It's not a state of the world. So you can't, right, condition, a policy on how much reward you've accumulated or things like this. It's not playing. It doesn't have any kind of function. Reward doesn't have functional significance in a sort of permanent way to the agent. When I say it's just a scorecard, it's not playing a functional role. It doesn't actually help you plan, like predict when or where things are happening. That's all I mean.
So you mean
They
that
just
if I have had to put it into words, you mean that all that you're doing is like keeping a tab of how much reward is associated with each state and action pair.
Yeah,
And so you're not really, there's no temporal structure in that. So if you go through a certain sequence of actions, you don't necessarily, you basically just have the final score of like what's gonna happen if you take that action into.
right. Yeah. So if I'm playing Zelda and there's 5 ways of beating Zelda, and maybe this is a very sparse reward problem, there's only 5 rewards in the game in this high dimensional space, right? My Q function or value function doesn't say anything about what events are going to happen, anything. It doesn't tell me where I'm going to end up, nothing like that. And so it is intrinsically uninterpretable. It doesn't tell you. There are few exceptions. If you have one, shortest path policy to one goal state, you can use, for a deterministic system, you can extract this probability information and time information from the value function. But in general, that doesn't hold.
And regarding the what you said about the information about the world, Do you see approaches like successor representations, which try to separate
Yeah,
the
I'll
transition
talk.
from the reward?
I'll talk about that in a few
Okay,
slides.
cool.
But yeah, we'll get there.
Thanks.
So so if I was saying if you change the structure of the world, say you close this gap here, your value function can change drastically. And that happens in high dimensional space as well, right? Small changes, the tree becomes far enough from the lake such that now you're too far away and you're going to die of dehydration or hunger, right? Some small changes in how the structure of all of these systems interacting can have huge effects in terms of the value function. So now let's take a different look at a new kind of Markov decision process and Bellman equation that address these issues that I just stated. So let's consider a task, what we'll call a task MDP, which is states, actions, a world transition model, and then instead of a reward function, we'll have a goal function G and a constraint function C. So the goal function G will just output 1 if you achieve a goal, or 0 if you're not achieving a goal from a specific state in action. And it can output a probability of 0.5 too if you want randomness, but we'll just stick to zeros and ones for now. And then a constraint function is just going to output a 1 if you're not violating a constraint. So ones are good. And then it's going to output a 0 if you are violating a constraint, such as, I fell into the fire, it's going to, output a 0. So here's the structure of the new Bellman equation. We're going to have a cumulative feasibility function here, kappa, which is the sort of analog of the value function. And this is going to represent the cumulative probability that you achieve a goal from a current state while not violating constraints along the way, such as falling into the fire. So F here is an achievement function, and F is just the product of your goal function and your constraint function. So that means F is saying you achieve the task if you achieve the goal, but you don't violate a constraint at this specific state action. And then we're going to have a continuation function, H, get at a state action, which is just 1 minus C, or 1 minus G times C. So you're not achieving the goal from, say, this state, but you're also not violating a constraint. So you can continue acting into the future. So this is a sort of replacement for the discount factor. And then we have an expected future feasibility when you act into the future. Okay? So we will also be minimizing the time it takes to achieve the goal as a sort of conditional optimization. I won't say much about this, but basically there are multiple ways that you could achieve a goal with probability 1, or achieve a task with probability 1. And so in that set of policies, we really want the time minimizing one. So this is a conditional optimization that's only looking at A star, which are the good actions which maximize the cumulative feasibility. And here is the most important part, which is what is called a state time feasibility function, which is going to say, given I start at some state X, what is the state and time? What is the probability that I achieve the goal at some state and time? So that's the probability that you don't achieve the task now, but you achieve the goal at a specific state time in the future. And this -1 is going backwards. So time here is a stopwatch time from when you start the policy from X. Then we can also have a state time infeasibility function, eta minus, which is the probability that we violate constraints along the way. So say fall into the fire at a given state time. And at t0, these have a boundary condition. So either you achieve the goal, that's what this means, at t0 where you are, or you fail the task at t0. And this indicator function here is saying the task is feasible. It's saying kappa is greater than 0. This kappa here is greater than 0. And you violated constraint. That's 1 minus c. Or the task is infeasible. So this bar indicator is saying kappa is not greater than 0, or it equals 0. And so you fail the task if you're sort of disconnected from the goal, right? You can't reach the goal. And so these two representations don't sum to 1 by themselves, but when you add them together, you can prove that you can have a full probability distribution over the events that happen under your policy from state X. So if I start from state X, there's going to be, and maybe I have noise in my controller, there's some probability that I'm going to hit the fire, and there's some probability that I'm going to get to the goal of drinking from the lake. And all of those events are going to be represented in this distribution. So if we sum over XF and TF here, we're going to, this is going to sum to 1. And in reinforcement learning, there's the concept of an option. So these are called option kernel Bellman equations. So what's an option? An option is just a policy, which is what we're optimizing, and a termination function beta that says, this is when you stop using the policy. So it's when you stop the policy and say, perhaps choose a new policy. So a termination function is just going to say, either I achieve the goal, or I violate a constraint, or the goal is infeasible. And all of these events are going to say, the function, termination function, is going to say, stop using this policy. So these Bellman equations are directly optimizing the predictive map for an option that maps you from when you start the option to when you finish the option. Okay.
Tom, can I ask some question?
Yeah.
About the previous slide. Yeah. Okay. Starting from the top right, you have this figure that suggests maybe the goal state is not just one state. It's possible to achieve the goal in multiple places because you have 2 places where there's a lake, right?
Yes.
So it's not a constraint of this framework to have a single goal state. You can have multiple.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you mentioned that there are some of these numbers you actually made a statement about what they are, like they're real numbers and they add up to 1 and so on. If that doesn't take too much time, can you actually give us a little more intuition about these constructs are new to me, and I suspect they're new to many other people as well. Can you give us some intuition about what these numbers are? Are they probability distributions? Are they real numbers between this and this, interval?
Yeah. So this function here, the cumulative feasibility, is a function that outputs a number between 0 and 1. And that is a Bernoulli random variable that you will complete the task, which is getting to the goal without violating constraints. It's a Bernoulli random variable for that. The policy is just the policy that maps states to actions. I already said what F and H are, but these are also functions that output probabilities between 0 and 1. State time feasibility functions for success events. This does not sum to 1, but it records all of the probability mass of successful events. The same is true for the state time infeasibility function, which records all the probability mass of the unsuccessful task events. And then once you add these two together, this function here is just a conditional joint distribution. So this is outputting, a probability for any given state and time. It's outputting some probability between 0 and 1. Does that help?
Thanks. Yeah, very helpful.
So let's visualize some of these. Yeah.
Hey, Tom, can you go back to the previous slide really quick?
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, is it like a hard constraint of this framework that basically you have just a single goal that might correspond to multiple goal states, but like a single goal in the environment, all we care about is achieving that goal in the like minimal time possible. Whereas like in a standard RL framework, right, there's like different gradations, right? Some states might give you lots of rewards, some might give you little bits of reward, and there's like a smooth continuum or trade-off between those. Is that like an intrinsic feature, or just like something that you chose to add because it made the math easier, or like how should we think about this, like the definiteness of a goal?
Yeah, so the goals will, as we'll see in a few slides, the goals will sort of naturally emerge out of the structure of how different systems interact. So if I go to a lake to drink water, that's going to influence my hydration space. And so when I say that a goal is probability 1, you can kind of think of this as the probability that you're going to induce some kind of causal influence on some other state space, like how thirsty I am. So this removes, as you've pointed out, this removes the kind of normativity of the goal, right? I'm saying we just want to represent the probability that I can complete these goals. And I mentioned empowerment at the beginning of this talk. Empowerment's going to come in to tell you why you should have specific goals. So whereas in reinforcement learning, you can have various levels of reward on various goals. You can still have normative quantities that tell you how good a goal is. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I'll loop back if you don't answer it in a few slides.
Sure.
There's a question from Michelle as well.
Yeah.
Sorry. So could you go back to the last slide again? I think my question is going to be a bit naive, because I'm definitely not an RL expert, but it seems like in this framework now you sort of are having this trade-off of one set of constraints and one set of goals, and you kind of almost, the way I'm reading this is you kind of treat them equally. And I'm just wondering, does this framework, or would this framework, maybe that's future work, I don't know, accommodate sort of like a gradation of like their like catastrophic constraints, right? Like I'm imagining if this badger actually goes into the fire, like that is catastrophic. But then maybe you start getting infinities and you don't want that. So who knows? But does this framework accommodate saying having multiple sets of goals? Maybe that introduces a new term into the achievements. Like, I don't know, you have like high goals or intermediate goals or coupled goals or catastrophic constraints.
Yeah, so I am working on this more, but even in the current work, the answer is that yes, an agent can, in principle, use things like empowerment to justify why some goals are better than others and why some constraints matter more than others. So you might have constraints that are, social faux pas, which are minor to some other harder constraints, right? And you can have to deliberate whether, the sort of trade-offs between goals and constraints. But I'm going to argue that in order to do that kind of deliberation, you really need the right kinds of predictive representations to understand what the consequences of violating such constraints are. And so the problem with reinforcement learning is that it destroys a lot of information that makes making these normative judgments possible in high dimensions. And that might sound kind of vague right now, but hopefully by the end, I'll give you a better intuition of what I mean. Okay, so let's visualize some of these equations. Say I have a grid world here, and let's move this. I have a grid world here, and I have two sets of goals. So I have 3 states here for G1 and 3 states here for goal 2. So I achieve a goal if I get to any of these 3 states. And then I have constraint states here, which are salmon orange colored. So I can, and let's also say I have, some noisy dynamics. I usually go in the direction I intend, but sometimes there's noise in other directions. I can split this into two tasks, task one here for goal one, and then task two for goal two. And if we look at kappa, which is the cumulative feasibility of achieving the task, then these heat maps here are quantities between 0 and 1. So if I take a look at a starting state, maybe purple here, and if I evaluate, this purple state here, it's going to return pink, which is about 0.5. And that's because if I have noisy dynamics and I have to go between these constraints, I'm going to lose probability mass to violating the constraints en route to the goal. And here for task two, if I started here, right, I'm about purple and this is about 0.25. And that's because I have to go through these constraints and I lose 0.5 probability of getting through. And then I have another 0.5 probability of getting through. So it's about 0.25. And then the policy here is just going to choose a sort of minimum shortest path that maximizes the cumulative feasibility. And then here we have the probability mass of the positive events. So if I start at this purple state, that is conditioning this state here. Here is the marginal distribution over final state. So I will go down the center most of the time. So it's the darkest. I have the highest probability of being there, but I might drift off to the side and end here. And the same as we can show the infeasibility. So if I start from this state, I will have some probability mass fall into the constraints. And then, as I mentioned before, we can add both of these together to get the full probability distribution over goals achieved and constraints violated, right? So this is just going to sum to 1, and we can visualize that if I add this map with this map, I get this map. So if I sum over red and green, that sums to 1. And there's also a time distribution that I'm not showing in these maps, which is the blue part of this distribution corresponds to the darkest state, and then green and orange correspond to the time distributions of these states. So you can see it's about 10 time steps from here to here is the soonest that I could achieve the goal, but it could be longer. And the same is true for here. If I start from this state, there's a time distribution to get to these goals. Now, what these maps really represent is if I took a deterministic one-hot state vector with all the probability mass on the initial state, and then I diffused this through the Markov chain of the policy. So if I have a policy, this is going to induce Markov dynamics through the state space. These maps really just represent where the probability mass is going to freeze under this forward diffusion. So this diffusion doesn't happen in an optimization. It's just what the maps mean. Okay, so you can have, this is what it means for this. Now, the really important part about computing these state time option kernels is that they're compositional. So if we have two options, one option, one policy for doing this task, and then one policy for this task, and we create a plan, which is just a sequence of options. I'm going to do option 1, and then I'm going to do option 2. Then you also want to be able to compose the predictive maps, right? So eta, this row should be mu actually, but eta mu is going to be this state time option kernel for 1, composed with the one for task 2. And so we can compose these into a new predictive representation. So this equation here is showing that if I start at this stage, right, there's going to be an intermediate final time for this task, and then we can sum over all of the intermediate times to get the probability of the final time for the chain of options. And then we're also summing over the intermediate states for doing goal 1. And this is going to give you the probability of arriving at the final state after the second option. So that means that we can compose these maps into a new map. So here's the new map, and you can see that there's no green here because we marginalized over all of the green, and there's some green here, right? And it's lighter because you're losing probability mass. And here's the time distribution, which is the convolution of these two time distributions. So we have the same sort of thing for this representation. So this is very important because if for like a theory of compositional generalization, if you have predictive maps for multiple tasks, you want to say, you want to think of, oh, what if I do this task, and this task? Well, you also want the predictive map for it. And this gives you an exact equation for how to get that map. And that's not true for successor representations, by the way, which I'll come back to.
Question.
Yeah.
Just a quick question.
Yep.
Sorry, I think I missed the point. Why is it that when you do this composition, you lose the green on the right, but not on the left?
Yeah,
like you lose the
because,
green relevant to task 1, but not task 2.
right. Well, so you're summing over, you're mapping from an initial state to the final state of task 1, and then that state conditions the conditioning side of this one, and you want to know where will I end up after this chain. So you don't lose the green mass here because that's where you end up after the chain of options.
So I guess, yeah, the order matters here. Like if you were to do task 2 and then task 1.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, one more question, Tom, before we move on. So since this composition operation is a central piece of this theory, can you explain where does this come from? Does this follow from earlier assumptions, or is it a new assumption that you add here?
You can derive this from the Bellman equations, but there's no, I'm not sure what you mean by assumption.
Yeah, I'm just saying, like, can you derive it, or did you just, that was a question, and you said, okay, you can derive it. Thanks.
I did not put this in the appendix of my paper, but yeah, you can derive this.
Cool.
Yeah. Maybe I should put that in the appendix of my paper.
Yeah, I think that's much cooler than, just putting it, yeah.
Yeah. So let's see. I'm going to skip over this, but Adam might be interested in this. You can, if you have a distribution over state-time events, you can get the reward distribution under some option. And you can also get the expected value. But I'm just going to skip over this because in the interest of time. Okay, so we have two different Bellman equations. We have reward max Bellman equation and an option kernel Bellman equation. And the cumulant for the reward max was a value function. And then the cumulant for the option kernel is cumulative feasibility, which is event-based. It's the cumulative probability of events. And the predictive representation for this Bellman equation is called the successor representation, which is recording occupancy counts. So if I start from state xi, under this policy, how many times can I expect to find myself in state xj? And that's discounted as well. So this isn't a formal prediction in terms of a probability. It's an expected count. And here, this is an actual probability distribution. And that's important because it makes it composable, right? So successor representations do not sequentially compose. You can't have, one policy with one successor representation and compose the successor representations with another to get a new successor representation. But you can with state-time option kernels by the Chapman-Kolmogorov equation. And so next, we're going to talk about high-dimensional factorizations. So if instead of X, I have bold S, right, neither the value function evaluated on S's or successor representations don't factorize into components. And this is a huge problem for reinforcement learning. So no, there will be no factorization here, but here there will be because joint probability distributions factorized by the chain rule. And so we can exploit this. All right. So now let's talk about compositional and modular world models. So if I have some base transition kernel for a grid world here, and some secondary transition kernel for hunger space, say py here, where y is the state of my hunger, then we can actually connect these two transition kernels. By the way, if you're unfamiliar with this, a transition kernel is the same thing as a transition model. It's just a stochastic transition model of how one state transforms to another. So we can have an affordance function that couples these transition kernels. So what's happening here is that if I am in a state and I take an action, it's going to advance me to another state, say this way, but also it's going to condition this alpha that's going to set the dynamics of the higher level space. So if I'm not eating from a tree, I might set this alpha parameter, and that's going to make me hungrier over time. Or if I'm at the tree, F might set an alpha eat, which is going to take me to the top of the hunger state space. And so alpha is not something that the agent has direct control over. Like A is something that you can directly optimize. Alpha is just automatically induced from a state action. So the transition kernel, the joint probability distribution over next states is just given by this equation here. So we're just summing over these alphas here, and that's going to produce this transition dynamics model here. And the same can be done if you have multiple state spaces. So if you have, hydration, hunger, and temperature, right? We can just have an affordance function, which is going to output, some set of alphas, some vector of alphas, which is going to set the alphas in the higher level space. So I'm going to use bold D here to be a vector of W, Y, and Z, which are going to be the internal state variables, for instance.
So does F output a binary? So for each alpha, it's just either it's possible or not, right? Is that the way to think about this?
Yeah, alpha is a probability distribution. So it's like, it is it outputting an alpha which is a sort of uncausal, variable that just makes this go down over time, or am I like drinking, so it's going to take me up? So I can basically evaluate this just like a probability distribution.
Okay.
So you can get the joint dynamics the same way as the last slide here. But I included one extra thing, which I call a mode function, and that's zeta here, which is going to say, if I hit any of these states, it might kill the agent, right? So if I'm starving and I'm in Y0, it's going to make it so I can't move around, and so I'm sort of dead in a sense. But if I'm out of any of these states, then I'm just going to have normal grid world dynamics. So E here is just conditioning the dynamics mode. And so that means that there can be, bidirectional influences between state spaces. Okay, so are there any questions about this?
Yeah, could you say something more about this dynamics mode and this idea of different levels in this hierarchy conditioning each other?
Yeah. So the reason I'm going to have dynamics modes is just one, to show that this doesn't have to be a sort of hierarchical interactions between state spaces, but also when it comes to things like empowerment, which is controllability, you want to be able to say, you want an agent to make sort of intrinsic value judgments about why certain states are good. So if certain states in an animal state space have some kind of catastrophic effect on how dynamics can propagate through its world model, then you want to be able to have measurements which tell you how bad that is. So I'm kind of also just including this just to make points about empowerment and stuff like this, and how you can have value arise from the structure of the world model.
So in intuitive terms, would that look something like the agent representing this whole space of possible events or actions that it could take, and then representing the fact that if it dies, then this whole thing will be reach
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And you could think of like, it doesn't have to be that catastrophic. It would be like losing your job, right? That sort of closes down a bunch of skills and state spaces that you can't control. It doesn't destroy the system, but there's a kind of, a cascade of a loss of influence. So if we have, do you have another question?
No, please go on. I might have one later.
Sure. If we have these sort of composable or sort of factorized world models, the question then becomes, how do we plan on them, right? So you have to be able to have control policies that, control this transition kernel. So now I'm going to talk about how these option kernel Bellman equations that I told you about before help create factorized predictive representations that help you plan through it. Okay, so if we have this sort of high dimensional world model, that's this down here, what we would want from this framework is a prediction of how the entire state vector is going to transform under a policy, right? Having this prediction would be very useful, but the problem is that it's very high dimensional. Right. So you run into the curse of dimensionality. You can't just solve the Bellman equations directly because you can't store the entire equation in memory in your computer. So, but ultimately you want this. So the nice thing about these option kernel Bellman equations is that this predictive representation can factorize by the chain rule and conditional independence. So here, this is factorizing into a base level state time option kernel, which tells you how you're going to move around the base state space, and also predictions of what these states are going to do after a given time, right? So if it takes me TF time steps to go somewhere in this state space, I want to know if I start at this state, where is it going to be after TF time steps? So this would be the final state of any one of these. And these rows here are just going to be, they're defined in terms of the Markov chain dynamics that naturally happen under the policy. So that's what this is. It's the Markov chain raised to the power TF. So this holds if you're not violating any constraints under your option or your policy. So the minimum time that it's going to take to violate a constraint in the hydration space is 4, right? I'm 4 steps away from dying. So if I have an option that goes to the lake, it only takes me 2 times. So I'm really fine, right? I'm just going to, all of these state spaces are going to update by 2. And so that means that this is a valid option. But if I go down to the tree, that's 5 time steps away. And so these might be good, right? I'm not violating any constraints in these spaces, but I would violate a constraint in this space. So this means that this option is invalid. So this factorization holds when you are not, but when you have conditional independence that you're not violating by saying, going into some constraint state. So this is very useful for like decomposing or carving nature at its joints in a way. So what it means you can do is if you have many goals in a state space, like a lake, a tree, and a house, and so on, then you can solve five separate policies to each of these states. And you can have five separate predictive maps, eta, for each of these five state time option kernels. And then you can basically just create a huge factorized transition kernel called a goal kernel, which is just going to take in one of these options, and it's going to use this decomposition theorem to tell you how the full state vector is going to transform under an option. So this here is the state time option kernel factorization up here, and then it's going to terminate at some state, say the lake, and then there's a one-step update that says if you terminate at an action, then you have to update the result of that action. So if I terminate on drinking water, I have to have a one-step update that says now I'm fully satiated, and that's what this part of the factorization is doing. So how does G work? It's pretty simple. Basically, if you go from here to here, then this part is going to jump you from here to here. That's this arc, this dashed arc. But your predictive, your state predictions, hold on, this is choppy and I have to close something in my PowerPoint. Yeah. Share. All right, back in. Sorry about that. Okay, so, oops. All right. So if I go to the lake, I'm going to get that. And this is just going to tell me where I end up after I hop from here to here. So this is 2 time steps away. So I'm going to predict I'm here. And then there's going to be a one-step update once I drink water. And that's this final arc here. And the same is true for all of the other state spaces. There are rows for these state spaces. That's what this is. And then I can continue this journey. All right. And so you can see that you can just chain options together and you can get predictions by propagating the state vectors through. So you could go a different way. You could go to this tree and then you could go to this lake, but you'll notice that now this would pass through a constraint state here. And so this would be an invalid option, right? So this could not be satisfied. You can also, instead of having physiological state spaces, this could be a binary vector space. So you obtain an apple and then you obtain water and you obtain a key as items and you just register them in bits. So you can be flexible in terms of what your state spaces represent here. And so you can use this to solve very challenging planning problems like this agent needs to get all of the all 4 goals before they disappear. And there's no intermediate reward or anything like this, but you can compute this even in dynamic environments by chaining together these factorizations. And here, the agent has to get all of these 4 goals, but it can press these yellow buttons to open these red doors in order to complete the task. So like very complex problems can be made tractable by doing tree search over chains of options. So here's a sort of example from the paper of a problem that you can solve. if this agent has to collect, flowers and honey for its friend, and it needs a key to open this door, but it also needs to stay alive. This is a lot of complexity, but you can basically do tree search over chains of options to be able to compute a solution to this. So here's results. I don't have it, so so these items disappear. I have to fix that. But I'm going to skip over showing this, but you can basically visualize all of the probability mass, in these optimizations. So if you're doing forward rollouts of chains of options, you can compute all of the probability that certain events are going to happen. But we won't linger on this. Okay, so we're getting close to the end. And basically, so far in this story, I've shown you that we can compute these predictive representations, and this allows us to decompose sort of modular compositional world models. And it allows us to create predictive representations for our policies, which factorize in high dimensions. And now this leads us to the question of, what is a good goal, right? We don't have access to, what a good reward function is in high dimensions. How could an agent just do this intrinsically? So I'm going to talk about this function called empowerment, which can scale to high dimensions if you represent these types of factorizations. So what's empowerment? Empowerment is a function E of a transition kernel from a given state. And what it really means is, what's the channel capacity of the agent's world model between sequences of actions that it could take? So big A here is a random variable over chains of actions of length n. So n here is a hyperparameter, which is a horizon. And so A is of length n. And it's saying, what's the maximum? The channel capacity is the maximum possible mutual information between actions you take from a given state and what state you end up seeing yourself in. Okay, so that's bold X here. So you can kind of think of it as, what's the maximum information rate, or what's the maximum information that I could send to my future self? And mutual information decomposes like this, which we'll use on the next slide. But it's basically, the entropy of the final state after these actions minus the entropy of the final state, given that you know what the actions are. So if you have something like a double pendulum, and you optimize empowerment, you'll just make the empowerment, or the double pendulum, stand straight up, because this is the most empowered state. Basically, the agent has the most optionality of controlling to given future states if it's in this sort of precarious balanced state than if it were to start down at the bottom. So with empowerment, there's really. Did you have a question, Hadi?
No.
Okay. With empowerment, there's really two different extremes. One is if the world model, the transition kernel, is action independent, meaning no matter what action you take, the distribution of what happens next is always the same. So say a uniform distribution over next states. So you're just randomly diffusing over the state space. So in this case, the final entropy given the actions is actually the same as the final entropy if you didn't know the actions. So your actions are not actually informative about what happens. So if xt was my initial state, an empowerment of a horizon 2 could get me to all of these squares, but I don't have control over which square it is. So my empowerment is actually 0. And the empowerment is 0 because you can substitute this in for here, and you get entropy minus itself, and that's always 0. Right? The other extreme is if he is deterministic. So if your next state distribution is sharp, then the final state entropy over a chain of actions is going to be zero. You're going to know exactly what state you're going to end up in. And in information theory, this just means that the maximum mutual information is the logarithm of reachable states. That's this x here is the reachable states after n actions. So in this same case, we could still reach all of these pink squares at a horizon 2, but we can have a precise control over which state that is. And so the empowerment here is log 13. So empowerment can change at different horizons. So an empowerment at a horizon of 1 just means that black here is high empowerment. So I can get to 5 neighboring states at this state. So it's very black. And then in B is low empowerment because I'm up against these red walls. So these walls restrict my movement, and I can only get to 2 states, this state and this state. However, if the horizon is 5, then the situation reverses, right? In A, I'm stuck in this room of 9 possible states, whereas in B, I can spill out into this open space. So B is now a sort of more empowered state at a longer horizon. And so the problem is that empowerment is sort of limited because of this horizon. So it becomes exponentially harder to compute empowerment as n increases. And so that means that you couldn't compute empowerment here for say 30 time steps. So there's a sort of limitation in how information can propagate. But as we talked about in this talk, we constructed this goal kernel, which is really a transition kernel, right? This goal kernel is a factorized transition kernel. So that means you can compute empowerment on this factorization. And that's important because it means that we can now compute empowerment in high dimensions over longer periods of time. So that's going to be important because it means that we can justify why we should take long, perform long tasks into the future to achieve, states that we might have never experienced before. So we can compute the empowerment gain, essentially. So I'm getting close to the end here, so I'll wrap up pretty soon. But to understand empowerment gain, we can say, what if I had a state space like this where the world is structured in a specific way where I can't get through this mountain pass door without the key. So if the mountain pass door is locked, then there's going to be a factorization of G with this transition underlying world model. Okay, so there's going to be an empowerment with this G. But I could get a key, right? The agent gets the key, and now it can get through this door. And so this is going to be a different world model. And it's going to have a different factorization for G. And this means that there can be an empowerment for this key. So you can actually take the difference of the empowerment that you have with a key versus without a key, and you can compute the difference. So if I were just computing empowerment, the change in empowerment on single actions, you can see that with a key versus without a key, if I just do a state-wise subtraction of these maps, this is just going to have a very local change, which means that the key is only really valuable to me. I can only know that the key is valuable to me, close to this door, right? And that's because my empowerment is not propagating information very far in my world model. So this is, assuming we fix these states here. But if I compute it on G, right, if I have a key, that means that I could start here, right, and I could now go back and forth between these, the lake and the tree to stay alive. Whereas if I didn't have the key, then I would essentially starve to death, or I would just die of dehydration. And so this whole map is blank. So the difference of them is just, well, the same map. So this is a little uninteresting. I should put another tree down here or something like that. But essentially, you can see that the empowerment gain essentially reaches out much farther into the world. And the reason that that's useful is because it means that you can make judgments about why something like a key is intrinsically valuable to the agent. So if I were to have an agent that goes and gets a key and then brings it back to the lake, then you can basically measure, what is the empowerment gain of this task of going to get the key and bring it back to the lake, and that can be positive because you're opening this, and that means that now you can stay alive by controlling between eating and drinking. Whereas if you didn't get the key, you could not do that and you would die. So the important thing that I want to emphasize to everyone is that this is what makes it possible to make value judgments about why things matter in high dimensions. That is context sensitive, right? It's sensitive to a given state vector. And so essentially that, if I just change having a key or not, then I can basically quantify, how good is the key to the agent. So the key is registered in this bit phi here. And so that would be 3. So you can see how value can come from changes to how the agent is coupled to the environment. And it's worth noting that the problem with the standard reinforcement learning view is that you could make the case that you could do this with value functions. Like, I could understand the value of a key if I just changed the bit in the vector of whether I have the key or not, and just query the value functions differently. But the problem is that value functions in high dimensions don't have decompositions, right? And if you're just approximating it with a neural network, there's no, way to make this neural network adapt flexibly to changes in the structure of the world. So this isn't really a viable approach because value functions are inflexible objects. So you kind of have this problem over here. So this brings me to my last slide, which is that there's sort of 4 stages of generalization that are implied by this framework, right? I could have a world model like this, and if something about the world changes, say the tree is now over here, and now the house was over here, but now it's over here, then the only thing that would change in this setup is just the coupling between different systems, right? So my joint dynamics is new just because of a change to the coupling, right? But it's worth noting that my predictive representations are a function of the world model. So that means that if I figured out how to repair a factorized model of the world, I could also repair my factorization of my predictive representations. So you can also have the case where maybe these shift over, right? So now the lake is over here and not closer to the center. Then, you would have to repair this because your goals are in different locations. But nevertheless, you can kind of conceive of generalization as sort of repairing your factorizations for how to predict what your policies do. So if any of these are new, that means your goal kernel is new. And so if any of your plans for solving, tasks are dependent on your goal kernel, then you might have to reevaluate your plan. It might still be optimal, but it might not be optimal, right? So this G new could change, and that means you have to compute a new high-level plan. And this can also affect whether or not you value a key, right? If the structure of the world changes, your values for things in the world might change. And that can change if G changes. So you can see that there's a kind of dependency structure between fine-grained knowledge of how the world works that cascades up through your predictive representations all the way to, do I still value this anymore, right? And these types of intrinsic judgments are just not supported by reward maximization theory. It doesn't entail a deep sort of theory of generalization like this, but often kernel-Bellman equations do. So I'm going to skip over this because it's the related research and just get to my closing slide, which is, value functions don't have high dimensional factorizations, but option kernel Bellman equations have a different form that produce these sort of abstract transition kernels that tell you what your options are going to do in high dimensions. And because they're distributions, stocks are compositional, they compose with each other. They're factorizable, so they can refactorize if the structure of the world changes. And they're interpretable because they say what events are going to happen under the policy, which is what value functions or Q functions don't do. So many stocks can be aggregated into a goal kernel, and that's what makes it possible to compute the empowerment gain, which I called valence. I don't think I was clear about that in this talk. But this allows you to justify, goals and also constraints as well. And so this leads to a sort of qualitative theory of generalization that I think is really missing in reinforcement learning. And it also allows empowerment gain, allows agents to reason about competing goals and represent competing goals as a single value without, using Pareto frontiers or multiple value functions or things like this. And with that, I will there we are. Okay. So with that, I just want to say thank you, and I will take questions.
Tom, any questions? Go ahead and unmute yourself.
I can maybe start. That's a really great talk. So thanks a lot. Maybe you include this in your related work slide that you sort of glossed over. I was wondering how this relates to like Imo Todorov's work on like linear RL and like the resurrection recently from like Perret and Daw, if you're familiar with that literature, because it seems like they're trying to solve a lot of the same problems. And then in that direction, if you've thought it like, well, I'll stop there and then I'll ask my follow-up later.
Yeah, so I was really into Ivan Todorov's work at the beginning of my PhD, and I actually wrote a paper on it that I'm still trying to get published. But basically, Ivan Todorov's work has a compositionality result, which is basically you can compute control policies to multiple different targets or states. And the solutions to those can be primitives, which you can mix together to a composite solution with a sort of reweighting of which goals are important. But I think that this result is not very strong just because it basically implements a kind of OR logic, right? I either do this goal or I do this goal, and I can change the weights of which goal is important. And that's going to give me a linear sort of composition law, which tells me how to adjust my policy. And it's a very cool result, but it doesn't entail a prediction of when and where you'll be somewhere. So the fact that we're constructing these state-time optimum kernels is giving us the predictive knowledge to be able to sequentially chain together predictions of what your policies do. So I would say that, Todorov's work is a kind of spatial composition of value functions over a state space, but it doesn't necessarily have a decomposition in high dimensions or anything like that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. And the sort of follow up there is, people have shown within neuroscience how these kinds of goals can often like warp or distort things that we think of as predictive representations, like place fields, like grid cells, etc. Some of these things have been related to the SR and like Kim Stakenfeld's work, others to this like linear RL hypothesis. And I wonder if you've thought about going at all in this direction and sort of like reanalyzing these like canonical results in the sort of neuroscience of navigation literature, and if there are any sort of unique predictions that one would make based off of your kind of factorization or decomposition that you might not necessarily make in these other frameworks that are similarly trying to break down different components of RL.
Yeah, I would say that, well, I'm not a neuroscientist, so I don't really have a deep knowledge of like how these sort of like hippocampal distortions or, maps are distorting. I'm aware of these results, but I couldn't tell you why that happens. I guess I think that this could be useful for thinking about hierarchical planning or composable planning, especially like, there's a lot of neuroscience about like how your prefrontal cortex represents task, structure. And I think Thomas Occam has a lot of research on like, representing, time to goals or things like this. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity to think about how, different sort of predictive representations can be remapped to different task structures that we don't really have great formalisms for right now in neuroscience. But maybe you know better than me.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to make of all, like, yeah, PFC like is maybe the most flexible region in terms of mapping on to whatever task commands we give the animal. I don't really know what that means in terms of like, is that telling us something intrinsic about how the animal is reasoning about the world, or is it telling us something extrinsic about the task? But maybe we can leave it there for now and let other people ask.
Eli, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I noticed that what you're showing us in this presentation is basically grid worlds.
Yeah.
And so I am going to ask, the mean but obvious question,
Yeah.
which is, have you been able to do anything with this formalism in continuous state spaces?
That is
Or
my
actually,
goal.
you did show an inverted pendulum, so
that was from Polanyi's paper. But so yes, I am interested in getting this to work in continuous state spaces. But the thing that's needed is to go from high dimensional observations like pixel space down to factorized discrete transition kernels, like the kind of factorized transition kernels that I use in this paper. So there's only one paper I know that does this, and it's by George Conadaris, and it came out 2 months ago. So it's by Conadaris and Cam Allen at Berkeley. It's called Pixels to Factors, and I think that this type of approach needs a lot more attention, and it's very interesting. But it would ultimately play well with my formalism.
okay. So as a follow-up from there, how would you say that your approach compares with both goal condition reinforcement learning which has had a lot of development in the past several years. And also with sort of the occasional on and off papers we see, I think there was one at NeurIPS this year or last year on basically control as a self.
You cut out like control as the self what?
Based RL paper on
Uh,
autoregressive prediction this year.
so sorry, Eli, you cut out for a little bit. You said control as a what?
Control as a self-supervised learning problem using autoregressive models.
Hmm. Who is that by?
So there's a range of work. There's decision transformers from a few years ago. You know, and I'm thinking of this because the obvious thing to try for pixels to factors would be something like vector quantization, right?
Yeah.
But then, you know, there's also approaches out. I can try and find the NeurIPS paper from I think this year or last year, where they have an autoregressive model-based an autoregressive model for model-based policy optimization.
Yeah, if you want to send that to me, that'd be good. I guess in terms of goal condition RL, the main thing that's missing is, you know, time information and how you use time to do predictions of other things. Like, I mean, that's what I'm doing in my work is like sometimes you see goal condition RL and things like successor features, which is basically successor representations in a feature space, but successor features don't represent time to goals or anything like that. And, you know, it represents expected occupancy count. So people find ways to like chain together goal condition policies with successor features, but I don't think it's going to result in a kind of the kind of flexible intelligence or that we want.
Yeah, I mean, I had this similar question that Eli asked about goal condition RL because that seems also adjacent to your research and also one of the related works. There was a paper this year at NeurIPS that I think is pretty interesting. They had goal condition RL in the sense that the probability of achieving the goal, P of G, given your state, that's a number between 0 and 1. They just took that and called that their reward. And then they just did Q learning on that and, you know, paired with this other idea called using contrastive learning, like self-supervised RL with goal conditioned. So that worked really well, at least in their settings. And I wonder if you are thinking about taking your framework and then maybe just coming up with ways to train agents like with neural networks or something. Is that something that you want to do and like have comparisons to that kind of like adjacent models?
Yeah, I think you could probably train state time option kernels in the same way that you or similar way that you train successor features or something like that. I think that's a possibility. I haven't started on anything like that though.
So another question I had was, I really like your framework for several reasons. I mean, the compositionality is beautiful, and the fact that empowerment is an intrinsically subjective measure that depends on the agent, that is very interesting.
Yeah.
That kind of differs from standard RL. Can we think about your framework as closer to model-based RL as opposed to model-free? Is that an accurate way to think about it?
Definitely. Like I think that this is, yeah, it can be considered in the RL family if you want. I mean, I'm using the options framework, I'm using Markov decision process, et cetera. But it's certainly model based in the sense that I do advocate for like, you know, learning, you know, transition kernels of how the world works. So I think we need to exploit that as much as possible. And we need to treat, you know, running things like value iteration as like as like a primitive. Treat it like an O of one algorithm. I'd like to see more of that.
Mhm. Okay, so thanks for the clarification. So I wanted to ask the follow-up question. You said that this value function is more like a scorecard and it doesn't serve functional role, but maybe it serves functional role, but in the model-free case. So it's like it's a complementary approach, and we need kind of both. Something that is model-based, that is compositional and modular, and et cetera, et cetera. But the reason I'm asking this is because I can't really understand how when I eat chocolate, I feel good, and I don't know how I can understand that in empowerment.
Yeah.
Do you see these as complementary, or how do
I,
you?
yeah, I mean, I guess when I'm thinking about empowerment, a lot of what I'm thinking about is like the problem of justifying, why doing anything in really high dimensions, like why do a PhD, why sell your house and move to Hollywood and become an actor or whatever. Like you can justify abstractions. And so you're talking about things like hedonic um, hedonic value in a sense. And I don't think that it's incompatible. I don't think things like hedonic pleasure or pain are incompatible with empowerment, but I think it requires more theory. Like in a sense, like if I'm hungry, I can't really think of anything, right? There is the phenomenology of being hungry, which is unpleasant, but like it's distracting and I can't, do a task that I want to do. I have to get rid of this thing. So you could, make a kind of metacognitive argument that there are ways that biological systems, have evolutionary pressures to have like hedonic utility in some sense, but it plays into empowerment at a different level of abstraction.
Oh, so you're saying that it's possible to actually incorporate all of the above as some sort of empowerment?
I think it's possible. I'm not saying that that's necessarily true, but I think that like if you conceive of attention or metacognition of like, I have this task I want to do, but like I cannot attend to the things I want to because I'm hungry, then you could make the case that there is a kind of metacognitive empowerment.
Okay.
Hadi,
Yeah.
if I might back Thomas up a little bit here.
Yeah.
He did show in the formalism explicit interoceptive / homeostatic states as part of that state space.
Mhm.
And I think, insofar as people have modeled, hedonic valence in terms of reaching goals or desired distributions or just, applying some form of preference function to that homeostatic state space, then I think empowerment with respect to getting your homeostatic values into the optimal state could actually count as hedonic valence, at least in as much as anyone has really captured hedonic valence computationally in a biologically reasonable way.
I was literally just going to ask about what he meant by valence, so thank you. And how it contrasted with other interpretations. So
Yeah, I mean, what I mean by valence in this formalism is basically empowerment gain, but I understand that you could make the case that valence is a non-computational phenomenon. Um, but in the sense, I wanted to use the word valence because, like, if you lose your passport before your flight, right, you're going to start freaking out and turning over like all the sofa cushions and whatnot. You're going to panic, and that's a very complex interaction between very abstract things, right? Like, I can't go to a wedding and I was supposed to give a speech, etc. Like these are all abstractions that you acquire, but ultimately it has a kind of physiological effect and a kind of phenomenology. So I don't know. Does that clarify anything, Henley?
oh yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yeah, I had a.
There's another question here.
Wait, that was a really
Yeah.
great talk, Thomas. I think your stocks have a really flexible learning algorithm for like any arbitrary number of goal states. I was wondering, it seems right now your states are kind of like allocentric, like it's not really tied to where the agent is in the world. I was wondering if you had like future plans or thought about being like an egocentric state space. So like as the agent moves, like it sees different states that that surround it, and how that might adapt to being able to explore
Yeah.
very size
Yeah.
of the.
I mean, I would love to be able to like learn, egocentric state spaces. And I was talking to Cam Allen about this a lot. I mean, I don't really have an intuition about what is better, like when egocentric state spaces are better than allocentric or um, any any other kind of hybrid. But yeah, I think you definitely could. I mean, as long as you can write down a state transition kernel or learn a state transition kernel in which the sort of state is egocentric, certainly you could. But I guess the question is how. So if you have any suggestions, I'd be open to hearing.
Another question is maybe it's not about better, it's about more correct, right? So egocentric is perhaps more correct because we're just trying to model the agent, not the world. So
Right.
agent self-world, let's say. Yeah.
Right. But when I'm looking at a video, if I'm looking at a 2D video game, am I imposing an egocentric coordinate system from, Mario or Link or whatever? Or am I putting Mario or Link in a space in the map, right, in a allocentric way? I don't know the answer to that question.
Don't think about video games, think about Stoffel.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
But we can also, like look at, stuff outside of us and sort of impose state spaces on things, I think. But yeah, I agree.
Or I think just also thinking about it like the you only have a finite set of states or that your body can perceive, whereas like the world or the environment has infinite number. So I feel like finding parameters to model a finite set of states seems easier than an infinite set of environments.
Yeah, that's reasonable.
I think perception is key here. So I guess just to clarify my earlier comment, I mean, it's not always just egocentric. One of the biggest mysteries of the brain is, the visual cortex is egocentric retinotopic as you go even deeper in the hierarchy. But then somehow that maps into these allocentric representation in the hippocampus. So we haven't solved that. We don't know how the brain maps egocentric states into some allocentric representation. So it's like an open question in neuroscience too, but it's both, maybe. You need both.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, any other questions before we end the recording, and then we'll have like 10 more minutes for further discussions. All right.